about to see and hear the Szabados family history as was researched by me with the help of Irene, who helped type the story, relatives in Hungary, Valley Demeter, specifically, who is my first cousin, Brother Zoli, who being the absolute eldest of the family members, remembers much more than I do about the early days of Mom and Dad's life in Canada. But I got most of my information from my mom. Whenever I came to visit her the last 4 or 5 years of her life, I brought a tape recorder, and as we sat over coffee and reminisced about the old days, she could tell me one story after the other. Her mind was so sharp, she could remember things like it happened yesterday. Every minute little detail she could tell me, and if she happened to tell me again, it was exactly the same. So I knew it was absolutely in her mind just the way that it happened. She wasn't aware at this point that the tape recorder was running and recording all she was saying. I felt that it would be a detriment to have her know, because then she would feel self-conscious and she wouldn't talk so freely. It wasn't until after the November 1989 that I revealed to her the reason for all my questions. I informed her that I was going to write a history of the family so the generations to come would know what had come before. She just shook her head and said, "You're wasting your time. No one wants to know about the old things." I told her she was very wrong. I told her it was the richest legacy we could leave for our children and grandchildren to come, was to let them see and understand what had come before. This was our last recording time, the 3rd of November 1989, as we sat by her table. And of course, as she was telling me the stories, she was also going through birthday cards and Christmas cards to make sure that everybody had birthday cards and Christmas cards. You know, she never missed anybody's birthday in this family, and here she had just gotten me to buy a number of cards for her so that she had the next year's supply. And here she is. She's got them all organized and back into the bag, ready to be sent out on the appropriate days. And as we were talking, Sister Irene phoned Mom to have a chat with her. So Mom sat down on her stool in her kitchen and she had a chat with Irene. This, like I said, was the 3rd of November. She passed away the 12th of January, so it was the most... I dedicate this film, this history, to the memory of my parents, Steve and Helen Szabados, who at the ages of 20 and 25 decided to leave their families and home and country and seek out a new home and country without their families in order to better their lives and the lives of their children, to never again see their families and to never again set foot on their native country of Hungary, to their dying day almost 60 years later. This is a picture of Mom and Dad at their 60th wedding anniversary celebration in their home. The picture was taken in 1984 when Mom was 76 and Dad was 81. This is me, Eileen Nagel. I am the researcher, the narrator, the editor, the producer, and everything else that you can think of. In this film, I will be referring to each person as they are related to me. I am Eileen Nagel. I used to be Eileen Szabados. I am the fourth child of Steve and Helen Szabados. You will have to figure out how you are related to me to find out how you are related to each character in the film, because I will be referring to them as they are related to me. I couldn't think of an easier way to do it, so that's the way you can figure out, as I said before, how each person is related to you. It is traditional in Hungary to use the surname first. In other words, Dad would be Szabados István. Believe it or not, the name Szabados, about 240 to 250 years ago, our ancestors came from Slovakia, and the name then was Slobodny. So if you think Szabados is bad, try Slobodny. In Szabados, there is no direct translation from Hungarian to English, but the closest would probably be Freeman. Maybe it's Freeman. It means kind of freedom or free. But as I said, I would imagine if we translated the name to English, it would be Freeman. Now, Dad's name in Hungarian, translated to English, is Szabados István. The history of Hungary. At the time of the pyramids, at the time the pyramids were being built in Egypt, the Hungarian people lived west of the Ural River. Comparative linguistics provide the main field of research for what is known as Hungarian prehistory, for it demonstrates that the Hungarian language belongs to the Finno-Ugrian, F-I-N-O-U-G-R-I-A-N, group of the Uralic, U-R-A-L-I-C, languages, more precisely to the Ugrian branch, U-G-R-I-A-N. This is believed that the common homeland of the Ob-Ugrian and the ancient Hungarian, the Magyars, M-A-G-Y-A-R-S, which we are, our language, Hungarian language is Magyar, was along the central Volga. Entire families, from great-grandfathers to grandchildren, aunts, uncles, cousins, etc., lived together as a unit, with the eldest man being the head of the unit. 20 or more men would belong to one of these groups. The elder would designate each person's duties. Each family unit lived in an area in which they would fish and hunt. They had to work as a unit because alone they could not survive. As the game became scarce in the area, they would move. As time went by, they kept migrating westward across the Volga. In the middle of the first millennium, BC, the ancestors of the Hungarian people migrated from the lands they shared with other Ugrian, U-G-R-I-A-N, people, and moved south. Here they came under the influence of the Bulgar Turkic pastoral tribes, with the resulting change in their manner of life. Their primary occupation as mounted nomads was transformed into herding, and they lived a tribal society. Many wars ensued over hundreds of years. In 1241, the first sentries of the dreaded Mongol forces appear at the north and northeast passes of the Carpathian Mountains. After much fighting, it appeared as though Hungary had been annihilated by the Mongols. However, internal dynastic conflicts erupted within the Mongol Empire, resulting with the withdrawal of the Mongol hordes from the country in the summer of 1242 AD. Hungary survived, although greatly decimated in population, its towns reduced to ashes, the country survived. Turks occupied Buda, as in Budapest. One side of the Danube is Buda, the other side is the town is Pest. Turks occupied Buda in 1541. The central part of the country became part of the great Ottoman Empire. During the 16th and 17th century, there was an attempt to drive the Ottoman forces out of the country. However, it only resulted in defeat and further gains from the Turks. Furthermore, the Imperial Habsburg mercenaries plundered and devastated the northern part of the country, which had been relatively peaceful to this point. The Hungarians began an uprising against the Habsburgs in 1604. This war continued for many years. Wars and unrest continued into the 1800s and on into the 1900s, with the First World War and then the Second World War also. Russian domination until the uprising in 1956 continued. Although they were still under communist rule after 1956, the conditions of the country improved greatly, and the past 10 years is probably the best in the history of the Hungarians. Anyone wanting more information on the history of Hungary may get much more from yours truly. This is just a taste, and I don't want to bore you. So where do the Szabadoses fit in? Before we go on to the Szabadoses, this is a map that Valley sent to me. At the beginning, in your far right hand side of the map, is where the Hungarian people came from. If you will notice, you just follow the arrow to the circle, and that is the area of Hungary as it is today. This is the northeast part of Hungary. This is Budapest coming from here, going to Gyöngyös. Gyöngyös is a larger town. Then over here to Markaz. This is where Mom and Dad come from. This is where our ancestors live. And all our relations, about 250 of them in this village. And then we go over here to Eger. Eger means mouse, for what it's worth. This is a book sent to me by my cousin Valley from Hungary. It is the history of Markaz. Markaz, as this village stands today, was founded in 1875. This is the third village of Markaz that is standing. It was the first time, it was in the 1700s. It was situated between Junjush and Eger. I showed you earlier. This is Junjush, this is Markaz, and this is Eger. What happened was that Markaz was built on the path right between Junjush and Eger. And as robbers and beggars went from one village to the other way back in the 1700s, every time they happened upon Markaz, they would rob and loot the village. So they decided, the people of the village of Markaz decided they would move. So then they moved a little closer to the village, or to the river of Tisa, Tisa. Unfortunately, this was not a wise decision, because then the village would get flooded out. So the third time again, in 1875, they moved the village to the present site. And it is still between Junjush and Eger, but it was off the beaten track of what was at that time the trail of the robbers. Now again, back to the book on the history of Markaz. Page 60 of this book. And on top of the page it says Szabados Markaz. This is the first time that they have found the name Szabados. In 1730 he lived in Gyöngyösen, and in 1750 he moved to Markaz. Szabados Markaz's wife's name was Justina. In 1780, Markaz Szabados died at the age of 90 years. That's in 1780. That's the first account that we have of our ancestors. Further in the book, on page 162, there is the name Szabados Tamás. What this is a registry of deaths as of 1857. That's all it says on this page, is that Szabados Tamás died in 1857. And on to the page 175. It is saying that as of 1955, the most dreaded disease in Markaz at the time was cholera. Here it says that in 1855 there were 871 people in the village, and 8% of them died of cholera. And one of these was a Szabados Erzsébet. It says Ferenc András, 30 years old, and his wife, 27 years old, Szabados Erzsébet, died of the dreaded cholera disease. Now this is all that I can find in the history book regarding. I am about to give you a little history on the life in Markaz at the turn of the century and up to date. Nestled at the base of one of the Matra Mountains in the northeastern part of Hungary in the province of Heves lies the small village of Markaz. This village has been the home of our ancestors for at least 230 years. At the very center of the village, of about 1,500 people, is the Catholic Church with its high steeple and bell tower. At the turn of the century, 1900, it had a beautiful rich-sounding bell whose sound echoed across the village and out into the fields for miles. One day, as the First World War raged, a number of men seated in a horse-drawn wagon came galloping into the village, stopped in front of the church, and the men proceeded to tear down the bell and smash it to pieces, hauling it away to be melted down for ammunition. The people were very angry. But little did they know at the time that that was the closest the war came to their village. Although the wagons came to take the able-bodied men away to fight, no actual fighting ever took place there in World War I. If you can imagine, the wagons would drive into the village and the able-bodied men would be rounded up, and the day before they did not know they were going, and when that wagon came into town was the first that they knew they were going to be hauled away to be soldiers. A bell was very important to the people at the time. Not only did it ring out the time of the day, every hour on the hour, it rang out for the good news and the bad. There were no newspapers or telephones, so the bell was rang to call all the people to the church, at which time all news was imparted. A smaller bell was rang when there was a death to be announced. It was also a sense of security for those people working out in the countryside, hearing the bell ring out while they went about their daily tasks. The peasants were devout Catholics, but the church was not kind to them. The poor had to pay 1/3 of their income to this magnificent building. It looked so very stately among the tiny homes. If the poor couldn't pay their dues, the priest would not baptize, marry, or bury members of the family. If this happened, it was the greatest shame that could befall a family. So instead of food, many times the money went to the church. This was still this way in 1978 when we were there. I have nothing against the Catholic Church. I am not saying it because I do. I'm saying it because many times, time after time, this was told to us when we were there. The Mass lasted for 2 hours when we were at the service there. It was February and we almost froze before it was over. Yet the church was almost full, especially of little old ladies. And of course there were no little old men there because the little old men were all died in the war. How they can attend so faithfully in this unheated building year after year, I don't know. Bill and I both came down with terrible colds after attending only once. At the turn of the century, when someone died, they were laid out in their home on a table for 3 days before the funeral service was held. It was especially bad in the heat of the summer because even after the burial, the stench of the body remained in the house for weeks after. This is our Uncle Colmoyne when he passed away. Uncle John and Aunt Anna proudly showed off the new funeral home that had been built just a couple of years prior to our being there. Here is the service for Uncle Colmoyne. If you will note, on the right-hand side is the new funeral home. At the end of the 1700s, these are the homes that were built. Thatched roofs and log homes. In the late 1800s, these thatched roofs were built. The bricks were handmade and then plastered over. The thatched roofs were made of straw. The house measured about 12 by 25 feet and most often contained only one room, with a small corner partitioned off to serve as a food storage area, or it often contained a bed. The main room contained a wooden bed with benches, a brick stove, and a couple of beds. There was no floor, only the ground. A good homemaker would plaster the dirt floor with a thick mixture of yellow manure. This not only kept the dust down, but it gave the floor a nice sheen. If you were a good housekeeper, you did this at least once a week. This is Uncle John and Aunt Anna's house. Note at the back is a little part built on that was used as the barn. Built on the back of the houses was a small lean-to which served as a barn. As soon as the boys in the family were old enough, they had to sleep in the barn. The size of the family and the shortage of beds determined how old enough was to sleep in the barn. The boys who were required to live with the animals were fortunate because the barn was without heat, and the body heat of the animals warmed up the place. The rats were very prevalent in the barn also. They scurried around the boys as they slept, at times even taking a nip at them. The young men slept in the barn until the day they were married. Crude beds of rough lumber and filled with straw mattresses covered with homemade, home-woven blankets was placed at the back end of the animals. Mom once said that the young men always smelt like manure due to sleeping in the barn. She also stated that the boys were probably warmer in the barn than they were in the unheated houses in the winter nights. In 1978, when Lil and I went to Hungary, these barns were used by the senior citizens to live in. With the high price and shortage of fuel, it was cheaper than to heat the larger part of the house. Compared to this country, the senior citizens are very poor, with few or no facilities for their comfort, like lodges and nursing homes. Besides living in their barns, one hot meal was provided for the elderly in a senior citizens' home, where they could go to stay during the day from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. The state did pay for the meal, but apparently it was not very nutritious. They were given lots of potatoes and cabbage. The people running the home were strongly suspected of pocketing lots of money they saved by being so cheap with the food and the care. They told us all their problems while we visited there. Lil was very upset and told them, "They can't do this to you. You have your rights." I thought she was going to start a revolution in Markaz, Hungary, in the old folks' home. Having visions of being put behind bars, I finally had to tell her to hush up. You're not in Canada. We got out of there in a hurry with me dragging her out. We laughed about it after, but I didn't think it was funny at the time. But she did have a good point. The elderly couple right of the door lived in my grandmother's house, but they did not live in the house, they lived in the barn part. I don't know if they were renting or bought the house. In 1978, under communism, you could own the house you lived in and you could buy one more which you could rent out. While we are discussing my grandmother's house, this is the inside of her house. It was 3 rooms, and each about the same size as the other. One was kind of the living room, one was the kitchen part, and one was the bedroom. But as I said before, in all the time we were there, we never saw anybody live in that part of the house except my aunt and uncle. They lived in their house at least while we were there for a visit. From the time Mom and Dad were young, firewood was carried from the mountain behind Markaz on the back of the people. Few people had horses and wagons. The Szabados was one of the ones that did haul wood by wagon. But before Mom married Dad, Mom's family had no horse, and even when they did have a horse, Grandpa was usually away doing his work. Mom carried firewood home from the time she was so young that she was just old enough to go to the mountain with her mom and carry wood or kindling home in a small bundle. Later she and her mom hoisted large pile tied in the middle onto each other's backs and walked the mile or 2 home. Every stick burnt in the stoves had to be hauled home in this way. Again on this picture As in the last one, you can see the receding tree line. To the right of this picture, you can see what looks like sticks. That piece of land used to belong to probably my great-grandfather. He used to plant wheat, as did my grandfather, until they turned and decided to plant it all into grapes. From then on through to today, the family has always been able to supplement their income with the grapes. The sticks which appear in the picture on the right-hand side is the field of grapes. Again, notice the picture at the front are grapes again. And at the back, notice the water. When Mom and Dad were young, what is now water used to be a huge pasture of wild hay. Some of the people of the village came out there and cut hay for their animals. The landowner rented out the pasture, each family getting so many steps by so many steps. Although the property wasn't fenced, each person knew exactly what portion was theirs to cut. The majority of the land was owned by the rich landlords. And before I go on to that, I want to show you a picture of what is there now because of the water. There's a nuclear power dam built about a mile outside of Markaz. This is a nuclear power dam, and I know it is because Lil and I were there during its construction, and I have never been so scared in all my life, because Otto said to us one day that he was going to take us and show us the power dam. Now we said, well, we're really not interested. And he said, oh yes, I want you to see it. So can you imagine, he instructs us not to speak English, and we were going to go see the power dam. So he gets us to where the shift is coming off and another shift is going on. And there's Lil and I walking through the fence, past the guards, into the construction site of this power dam. And Otto would not take no for an answer. And there we are, just absolutely scared out of our tree. This is during the communist rule. There are guards, security guards everywhere. This is a nuclear power dam, and we are touring it. And the thing is, once everybody else settled down and went to work, there's Otto taking Lil and I around the site, showing us this power dam. Now, if you don't know what scared is, boy, just ask me. We did manage to walk in and out of there without anybody catching us, but if they had caught us, I am sure Lil and I would still be behind bars, because they would have thought we were spies. I mean, what are two stupid women doing at a nuclear power station but spying? As I said before, the majority of the land was owned by rich landlords. They hired the poor peasants and paid them very little. A work day was from sunup to sundown. By the time the sun was up, the worker had already walked several miles and was ready to work. They didn't start homeward again until the sun went down. The work was very hard. Although they helped with seeding, most of the summer was spent at the end of a heavy hoe. Men were required to work 7 days a week. Women only worked 6 days a week. The seventh was used for cooking, sewing, washing, and mending. The old ladies looked after the children, while the able-bodied men, boys, Women and girls all worked when work was available. There was no electricity, no central heating or running water when Mom and Dad were young. There were no bathroom facilities indoors. There were no bathroom facilities outdoors. No toilets. All members of the family used the backyard, going to different areas of the garden each time so as to fertilize the land evenly. In the backyard would be the chickens and the ducks and the geese and the pigs and the cows and the horses and the human beings. This is a picture of my Uncle John in his backyard. He is Dad's youngest brother. Mom told us of one of her neighbor ladies she used to watch when she was a small child. The lady didn't want to fertilize her own backyard, so she went and deposited beside her neighbor's house so as not to mess her backyard. Again, this is Uncle John, Aunt Anna, and myself in the backyard, but I guarantee we did not have to use the backyard. By the time we were there, they did have a toilet. But I must tell you something very funny, because the toilet was outside, and one night Lil went out to visit the toilet, and I snuck out behind her, and of course, being in a foreign country and everything's a little scary, I wait outside the toilet, and when she's walking back to the house in the dark, I let a big boo out of me. Well, I think you could have heard her screaming to the other side of Markaz, and Aunt and Uncle came running out to see what happened, and I don't think they appreciated our sense of humor. Here is a book with a picture of 5 little boys in their little shirts, in their little aprons, and their little bare feet. I'll see if I can get it close enough for you to see. This picture was taken in Although the people washed at home, when away from home, washing facilities were not provided. Mom tells of going to another province to work with Dad right after they were married, and about 80 other men and women were there also. The men and women slept together in a long barn, side by side, in straw. To wash themselves in the mornings, they cupped their hands while the water boy poured a dipper of water in their hand. So as not to lose the water quickly, they poured it in their mouth and then spit out a little at a time into their hands again while they washed their hands and face with that mouthful of water. They were gone from home for 3 months, and that was the only way they had to wash for that whole time. When at home in the summer, the women washed their whites in a creek. To whiten the whites, the clothes were packed into a tub. It was covered with a loosely knit material onto which was sprinkled wood ashes. Then hot water was poured over the ashes. As the clothes soaked in the solution, they supposedly whitened. This is the type of well that there was in Hungary. There was one well for the rich and one well for the poor. And I remember my grandmother talking about the fact that one day an old lady disappeared, and the poor people thought, oh my goodness, since she was rich, she probably fell into the rich man's water bill. So at night, because it was not allowed for the rich or the poor to go into the rich man's water well, in the night, when everybody was asleep, my grandmother ran over to the rich man's well and got her water, because she said she just knew that if that woman fell into that well, the water would cook the beans much faster from that well than it would have from the poor man's well. And she told us that story more than one time about how she figured the beans would cook faster. The sad part was the lady had fallen into the poor man's well. In the winter, there was a spring on the edge of the village from which flowed hot water. The young girls and women put their clothes that had been previously soaked in the ashes into the bag and walked the equivalent of several blocks to the spring. The spring was surrounded by rocks. The clothes were rubbed and beat on these rocks and rinsed in the hot water. Of course, the minute they were taken out of the hot water, they froze stiff. They had difficulty getting home because not only did the clothes not fit in the bag in their frozen state, the bottom of the women's dresses were also froze stiff, and their bare feet, which were now also wet, were very cold, making walking very painful. I remember Mom saying she hated going down to this spring because this is where the women gathered. And she said they were nothing but a bunch of gossips, and she just absolutely hated being there. Small children, boys and girls both, wore one-piece shirts until they were about 5-6 years old. I mentioned this earlier in that picture where the little boys are in their little shirts and their aprons. It got cut off, but the year was 1914 when that picture was taken. I took it out of an encyclopedia. Once they got a little bit older, they had to wear pants. And my Uncle John talked about the time when his mother made him his first pair of pants. And it was made out of linen, and it was so hard that it hurt him so bad and it rubbed his little body that he took it off and he put it in the manure pile. And his mother asked him where his pants were because he had put on his little shirt again. And he says, I don't know. And his mother was insistent until he finally had to drag it from under the manure pile, and she washed it, and he had to wear it from that day on. But he just hated it because it was so hard and so stiff. Girls also had lots of shirts, but and skirts, and they wore an apron over top, but they had no underwear. When nature called, the skirts were just hiked up a little bit, and in the standing position they proceeded to become comfortable. Dad says there were times when there was a bunch of boys, young boys and girls together, and he says you could see a boy and a girl walking along the sidewalk, and he says the girl had to go, so she just kind of step off the sidewalk and stand there and proceed to go. And about that time, Mom comes back with a remark and says, yeah, but those weren't nice girls. So that's all I know about it. This is a picture that was taken out of one of the encyclopedias approximately 1930, 1940, and it shows a parade of young people in their native costume. You'll notice that there the little boy is probably 8 or 9 years old, and he has long pants on. Mom tells me when they were growing up, shoes most of the time were saved for church. They went in bare feet everywhere. Actually, she said they preferred bare feet often because the shoes you could buy hurt their feet so much. When it was too cold, they bound their feet in rags. And they walked everywhere they went. Only, like I said before, a few people had horses. Since there were few stores in which to buy goods, the people used to do some bartering because they, the Markaz villagers, grew fruit successfully. They walked to other areas of the country and traded their fruit along with their butter, chickens, eggs, etc. for items they didn't produce. People had little or no money, so the method was very accommodating to all. Another vital commodity that had to be bought or bartered for was flax. The women had to weave the linen, make it into material, sew it into clothing, mostly by hand. This material was so stiff, many sores were caused by its rubbing, as I mentioned before. When I was in Hungary, our relatives showed us some of these linen items that had been woven. Without a word of a lie, they could stand up all by themselves. They were so stiff. Towels, tea towels, sheets, and men's shirts were made of this linen. This is a picture of a woman processing flax by breaking the stem after they had been softened by soaking. I wish I could remember Mom telling me how this was done. I do know that Mom told me on more than one occasion that she knew how to use a spinning wheel. I would have dearly loved to have seen her use one. As I said before, everywhere people went, they walked. Here, there's the man pulling the cart. That was their only way of transporting items from one place to another when you didn't have other means of transportation. Food was very scarce. So often when I was in Hungary, my relatives broke down and cried when they talked about how desperately hungry they used to be. There just was no food to be had. Meat was eaten maybe once a week, if at all. Cows were kept not for the beef, but for the milk and butter and cheese. Chickens, ducks, geese, and pork was eaten instead, though very seldom. When people went to the fields to work, they took their lunch. Breakfast was probably a piece of back fat, fried over the campfire, allowing the fat to drip on a piece of dry bread. Lunch consisted of a slice of bread and a boiled egg or onion. Supper was eaten at home, after the walk home. And if there was no family members at home to prepare something, they had to still do that. At times when people worked away from home, and the crew was large, 70 to 80 people worked in some fields together at one time. A crew of women were hired to cook in the field. Before I go on to describe that, I want to mention that because of the scarcity of food, they used to get, because it must have been a deficiency in their diet, used to get what they said night blindness. It seemed like as soon as night came, they became blind. And I remember my mom talking about a bunch of young people coming home, and she said they might have been tired, but there was always still tomfoolery going on. And this one particular time, Uncle John, who was just a young boy at the time, was the one that had night blindness. So they were leading him home, when whoever was leading him home was doing the usual kiddish pranks. They'd run him into a tree and they'd run him into the ditch, and this poor guy, he got run into and over top of and underneath of everything that was in the way on the way home. The next morning, apparently, when they woke up, they could see again, but from the time the sun went down, they could not see. I have never heard of it since the time that Mom told me about it, and I still wonder just what it could be, except that it must have been some kind of deficiency in diet. Speaking of
pork, even when we were there in '78, people did not have fridges or freezers. And what happened is they would take turns at butchering. When we were there, my uncle Kolman's family, Bertzi and Irene and their family, and there was some other members that had gone together to butcher a pig. And what happened is these people would butcher a pig, everybody would come, it would be all done in one day. Everything from the scalding to the butchering to the sausage making took place in one day. So there was a huge crew that did this. And then when that pork ran out, then another week or two later, or whenever the pork was run out, the same group would get together, only the next family produced the pork, and so on. There could have been 3 or 4 families that worked together on a butchering project, and they took turns. And that was still being done in 1978. When it came to chickens and turkeys or geese, each one did their own. But when it came to butchering a pig, this is what was still being done. Of course, it was so seldom that a beef was ever butchered that we didn't even hear about it when we were there. Now I must describe this picture to you. The barrel was used as a huge pot. Below the barrel was a firebox which heated the pot with wood. Everything was thrown into the pot and cooked as a stew. Mom said the cooks got paid quite well compared to field hands, but nobody wanted the job because everyone cursed the cooks for their lousy food. Now you may think that this picture goes back to the 1800s. Well, I have to tell you that this picture was taken in 1970, and the lady second from the right is my Aunt Anna. But the barrel, the cook pot, is the same as I'm sure that they used 100 years before. I think it is such a priceless picture, this one. I don't think anything was stressed more often than the poverty that existed before, and apparently it was up to about 1956 revolution. They were hungry. They were always hungry, they were told. And when they had to work, when there was work, they had to work so hard. Both were extreme. The landowners knew that the people had to work. They made them work hard, and besides that, they wouldn't pay them. I can remember Mom talking about the hardships, the times when she was just so little, she was just barely able to walk, and she would go and help her father out in the field. And he would have the scythe, and he would cut the grain. And she would come along, she said she'd be 7, 8 years old, and she'd have to tie these bundles up. And she said she could just barely wrestle them. But she had to hurry because she had to keep up to her father. A man got paid little, but a woman that did the same job only got paid half as much. This rule applied to young people also. Often a mother and a young son or young daughter worked on the job together because that way they could get the pay of one man. And of course, during the war, there were so many families left without a man because they had been killed in the war, that it was doubly hard to try to feed one's family. Young children got very little schooling because as soon as they were old enough to do a job, they were required to stay home from school, whether to work or whether to look after the younger ones, because the parents had to go to work and there was no one else to take care of them. I remember Dad talking often about how he had been left in charge of his siblings when his mother and dad were gone. And he was the oldest, but they were 2 years apart, so his 3 other brothers weren't much younger than he was, but he had the responsibility of looking after them. Mom and her girlfriends made a few pennies by hiring out to pick bugs off plants. And she said they were like 6, 7, 8 years old when they did this. That was before insecticides or pesticides, so that was the only way that they could keep the bugs out of the orchard, was to go along and pick everyone off. Then they would put them in jars, and then they would get a few pennies for this jar of bugs. When they got to school and they didn't know their lessons, the teacher beat them. Dad often told of how he went to school and didn't know his lesson because he had been home so much to help that the teacher beat him with a stick or a strap. And then he says the hard part about that was when he came home and his dad had heard that he got a beating, he got another one at home. He says he was required to stay home and look after the children, but that didn't make a difference. Dad only went to grade 1, while Mom got to grade 5. This is a picture that I thought really depicted what it was like in those days way back. This is a crew of about 30 men and women, of peasants who were standing here in line with their hoes ready to go to work. And Mom described their work as though these 30 people were a 30-foot wide cultivator. They had to stand shoulder to shoulder, whether they were men, women, or children, in the field, and they hoed side by side down the length of the field. And each one had to keep up to the other one. And there was a foreman that would either have a horse, and he'd be riding the horse, or he would be walking alongside, encouraging those that could not keep up. And when I mean encouraging, he would yell at them, he would threaten to send them home, whatever it took to keep those people going at a regular pace. And this is what they did, up the field and down the field. This is how the cultivating was done. One day, Mom and I were sitting watching TV, and there was a movie on, something like Roots, where it showed the black people out in the plantation. And I was saying how absolutely horrible this must have been for those slaves. And Mom says, I know what that was like. She said, it was no different in Hungary, she says, where we worked. She said, we had to do the same thing. She says the foreman did the same. He would try and encourage people to keep up, threaten them, whatever it took. She said the only difference was that he did not use a whip. Other than that, she says they got lots of tongue lashings or whatever. And if a person couldn't keep up, they were usually sent home. So you knew that you had to, if you wanted to get those few pennies, you had to keep up, you had to work hard, or there was no work for you. And Here is a little piece that I found in a Swiss paper printed in 1986. It talked about Hungary. The rapid increase in the population, which rose from 11.5 million in 1850 to 18.2 million about 1910 in Hungary, sharpened the prevailing class distinctions. The difference between the inhabitants of town and country steadily became more marked. While the town was industrialized and urbanized, the situation in the rural areas stagnated. The nobility owned enormous estates. Some 600 or so families of the Hungarian aristocracy possessed over 600 hectares of land each, while 184 families boasted real of over 6,000 hectares. The peasants working on these estates were mostly bound to their employers by annual contracts, but these could be prolonged by mutual agreement to last for a lifetime. Only a small part of their wages was paid in cash. Otherwise, they received payment in kind and the use of a piece of land. And the use of a piece of land was back when I was mentioning to you that they could get a little piece of land for their hay, so many steps by so many steps. Such generosity. It is because of the hard work that Dad and Mom decided to leave Hungary. Dad always said that if he had to tolerate the hard work, he could. But the thought of Mom having to do that same hard work for the rest of her life, he says it was more than he could bear. And he thought that he had to try something else, because nothing could be worse than the situation that they were in as far as he was concerned. My relatives always used to say, but Hungary was so much bigger at one time. And here in the National Geographics, I found what they meant. The orange is Hungary. The Kingdom of Hungary, the Turkish rule, and then the Habsburg rule. The Habsburg was 1740. The Turkish rule was 1566, I believe. And the Kingdom of Hungary, I believe that says, just a sec, I think it says 1400. No, it says 1100. And then continue the Napoleon era of 1812. Then we go to First World War, 1914. And then the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, I believe, where it has become just a little country. Well, some parts of the country were very poor. When you went to Budapest and some of the neighboring towns, you realize the difference between the rich and the poor. This is the famous Catholic Church in Budapest, the Markaz Templum, or the Matthew Church, St. Matthew's Church, I imagine you could translate it to. It was unbelievable. The closest that I have seen a church that was close to its size and its magnificence was the Notre Dame Cathedral in Montreal. Here is the inside. It was started in the 13th century. Can you imagine what the peasants had in the 13th century? Here is part of the outside. Well, the peasants in the country were existing. This one was restored in the 1900s. I walked down these steps. This is the National Museum in Hungary. And I remember being very angry because we had just heard about some of the problems that my relatives had had over the years just to exist. This is a marble staircase. Everything in that place was made of marble. This is a parliament building in Budapest. It has 365 windows, one window for each day of the year. What were the peasants doing when the marble staircases were being built? This is a shepherd. This is a fall coat. In the winter time he just turns this around and has the shaggy side in. I couldn't believe when I found this picture out of the National Geographics. This is how Mom said they washed their clothes. They had a board, a flat board, that they used to beat the clothes with. In the front there is a basket that they hauled the clothes with. They took them down beside the water and they beat them with this board until they were clean, wrung them out by hand, and took them home to hang up on some string or rope or whatever. But that stick in that lady's hand is very traditional at the time. It was called a Mongol. This board had one rough side and kind of a handle. Mom told me about it so often. This is the first time I've ever seen a picture. Going back to St. Matthew's Church in Budapest, I just read that it has somewhere inside 461 pounds of gold to decorate the inside of this church. And when you stop and think, it was started in the 1300s.
peasant just like they were. He was promoted to the foreman in the field. That was the day that their friendship ended, because he asked them that from then on he was supposed to be addressed as Sir or Mr. That was at his request. And he treated them from that time on like the scum of the earth. Unfortunately for the Mr., after the job was over, he was demoted back to peasant rank. But of course, his transgressions were never forgotten or forgiven. So, with the peasants, he lived the life of hell on earth from that time on. Compare the picture of that home to this church. This is again the inside of the church in Markaz. The luxury of the inside, it was just beautiful. It was hard to imagine when you walked in there that when you walked out, the two did not relate. The inside of this little church was so ornate compared to what an inside of a home was. As I said before, the church requested, and it wasn't I think I made a mistake and said a quarter of your income. It was a tenth of your income that you had to pay to the church. Mom tells and told me that she remembers a priest coming in and taking the feather tick off the bed of a person who had not paid their levy for the year. This is a picture of an inside of a butcher shop in Hungary in 1983. But going back to when Mom and Dad were young, Dad said he was always hungry. He was never ever full. Supper was often sour potato soup or bean soup or thickened bean soup or thin cabbage soup, and the treat was chicken soup. When they were out in the fields, as I said before, they had to be at their place of work by the time the sun came up. At 8 a.m., when 8 a.m. rolled around, after working for a couple of hours, they had a 15-minute break at 8 a.m. when they had something to eat. At noon, they had a half an hour, and at 4, another 15-minute break, and then they walked home. In their homes, people ate when they were hungry or when there was food to eat. Unless you were at work and had these specifically times when you had your break and your noon lunch, you had no specific times when you ate. You ate when you were hungry. Food was cooked on the top of a brick stove, and the food was cooked and eaten out of the same pot that it was cooked in. The pot would be put in the middle of the table, and each person had their spoon, and they dipped into the spoon. With their spoon, Uncle John often remarked that when he and his 3 brothers, and the 3 brothers being older than he, sat around a pot, the food fast disappeared. And he said because he was the youngest, he just barely got started when he was left staring at the bottom of the pot, because his older brothers ate it all up so fast. In those days, to keep meat from spoiling, it was cooked, put in large crocks,
and soaked in a salt brine. Now I remember that myself as I was young, around 10, 12 years old, my parents still doing that. Nowadays you can buy herring in a small tub, and it's soaked in a brine in the same way. The blood, when the pig was butchered, was saved to make sausage. The entrails were washed and used to make the sausage like they were the casings. The stomach was cleaned, and the blood was mixed with the ground beef, salt, pepper, and garlic, and cooked that way. The sausages to smoke were hung down the chimney where they smoked until they were ready. Here is a picture out of the National Geographics depicting an old couple in Yugoslavia. But looking at this picture and looking at the surroundings reminded me of one or two of the places that we visited in Hungary, of the senior citizens. I will never forget the time when we were invited for supper at one of the homes. It was Mom's dearest friend when she was young that invited us for supper. And as we sat there in this sparse room with the bed and a table and whatever, while we were visiting, the daughter of this couple came sneaking in with the food to be fed to us afterwards, well, at supper time. She thought we had not noticed, and of course we pretended we had not noticed. So you can imagine when we saw this that we ate very little supper to ensure that there was lots left over for them. You will notice the red stuff hanging on the wall. What it is actually red pepper. Something like jalapeno peppers. They use it in their baking, they use it in, or their cooking, I mean. They, I think, trade it for some things. I imagine this is their crop. And it's wearing black for mourning for the dead for a year is still prevalent today in Hungary. The older generation accepts this custom, but the younger generation has a real problem with it. Some young people bitterly told me that they haven't been out of black for years. You mourn for family members, parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, but also close friends or neighbors. The younger people cheat sometimes and wear black. This is an outdoor market in Gingish. Lil and my Aunt Anna and I went to visit it one day. Aunt Anna, like all the other ladies, had on her black scarf and her black coat, just like all the other 200 or so little old ladies that were there. So as we're looking around and looking at what there is to buy, suddenly we realized that we had lost our Aunt Anna. There were little black coated ladies everywhere. And finally we were getting a little frantic. We wondered, well, how on earth will we ever find her? So what we did is we had to check her pants, because although she had black on her pants, they were black and white herring tooth pants. So there we are, doubled over, running around the crowd, looking for one little old lady with a black scarf and a black coat, but herring tooth pants. And as we were looking, it was also, we were finding it very amusing. So there we are, doubled over, laughing like crazy, looking at the pants of all these little old ladies. And believe it or not, within about 5 minutes, we found her. But we could not have found her any other way because she looked just like all the rest of them. I failed to mention that the little lady on the far right is my Aunt Elizabeth. Brigitte Neni. Aunt Brigitte. Brigitte is a shortened version of Elizabeth. This is my grandma. In 1972, Mary Squara, she was living in Wainwright, and of course being in Canada, she discarded her black. I took this, or Lil took this picture. We were visiting her probably a month or two before she passed away in December of 1972. And I took this picture along when we went to Hungary to show her friends and relatives. They didn't say, "Oh, she looks very good," or "Oh, she looks happy," or "not well," or "well." They just let a gasp out of them and said, "Oh, she's not wearing black." And that was a cardinal sin. So we had to very patiently explain that although we also feel for the deceased, we do not show it here in Canada by wearing black. The young people thought that was great, but of course the older people thought it was absolutely appalling. And I am sure that some people turned over in their graves because my grandmother was not wearing black. At the turn of the century, there were very few doctors. For the people in Markaz, the closest doctor was in Gyöngyös, which is 5 miles away. The next closest was Budapest, which was about 40 miles away. Mom said it didn't matter how near or far they were away because no one could afford their services anyway. When I asked her what happened when you needed a doctor, she replied it was very seldom anyone went to see them, even if it was an emergency. She said that the people did what they could for the sick person or the patient, and if that wasn't enough, they died. She said simply with a shrug of her shoulder. Death was a common occurrence and accepted as a fact of life. The words crippled or blind was often used to describe someone in those days. I remember the day when Dad was saying that it was just assumed that when a person got older, they got blind. He says probably all they needed were a pair of glasses or a simple cataract operation. But in those days there was neither. When you take note of how many people wear glasses these days, you realize how many people could not see well in those days. During the communist rule, people were penalized for going to church. They were allowed to go to church, but the best jobs went to those that didn't go to church. Those that were married in a civil ceremony rather than a church ceremony found their lives to be much easier as the years went by. The church bell served another purpose for the village people. It would have a certain ring that would summon people to the village square in front of the church. There the bearer would report the news, such as an update on the war, the increasing taxes, or other bad news or good news that would affect people's lives. In later years, loudspeakers were erected in different sections of the village, and the news was broadcast over them.
As of 1993, there were no telephones in homes. In 1978, only one telephone, a payphone, existed in Markaz, although gas was in most homes by 1993. Up to now, they are talking now in 1994, talking about putting telephones into homes. But that will only become fact sometime starting probably this year. It was because of a priest in the village of Markaz that Dad quit going to church. He, his stepfather, his step-grandfather, his father, his two brothers John and Joe were hired to dig a well on a previously agreed depth. The contract was drawn up. Once having gotten to that depth, they found no water. But they kept digging because the priest assured them they would be well compensated. This was, of course, all dug by hand. They dug until they hit water. When it was time to pay, the priest said that the contract only called to dig so deep, and the fact that they dug deeper until they got water was not in the contract, so he did not have to pay for them. So they never did get paid for the rest. But to add insult to injury, it was such a deep hole to dig, and rocks had to be hauled from the distant hills to crib the well. So it took a lot of work and sweat. From that day on, Dad never went back to that church, but he did go to Junjish for confession before he... I showed you earlier, but I'm going to show you again. This is Markaz. Where I have the arrow, right in the center of the village of Markaz, is the original Szabados property. Now this same Szabados property is divided into two, and it is sufficient for both my Uncle John, and it was sufficient for Uncle Joe and their families. What had happened is that apparently Uncle John's was actually two properties, and when Dad sold his property, he sold his half to Uncle John. So Uncle Joe has, I guess Uncle Joe has a third, and Uncle John had the 2/3 of the property. It was just a long, narrow piece of land. I think in 1875, when this village of Markaz originated, and as I said before, this is the third village. The other two had to be moved. In 1875, I think that my ancestors, the Szabados, came to the village and bought this piece of land, or whatever, but this piece of land there in that part of the village. And I imagine those, when I think of some of the people that I met that are relatives, that are also named in that earlier book of Markaz, I remember now that most of those names are people that lived
in the center part of the village. In other words, they were the originals in the village. Around one side of the property that belonged to my great-grandfather and handed down to my grandfather and to my grandfather's 4 sons, one of who was Dad. Along one side is a wide rock fence that is probably about 2 feet wide, and it's kind of cemented rock fence, like a wall. I guess it would be more than a fence, and it still stands there today. And it looked like, when I looked at it, like something that had been there for many, many years. And I would imagine that it was the original wall that was put up back in the late 1800s. This is Markaz again. I have it color-coded where our closest relatives live. Up there on the top I have where we stayed with Uncle John. And close to that is the original Szabados house, and where Valley lives, Grandma lived, and Valley's daughter Valley lives, and Bertzi lives. Those are our very immediate relatives. Now, often when I was talking about the hard times were probably up to about 1956, when the revolution took place. Since that time, things have improved a lot. Hungary, although it was still a poorer country, was the best off of all the communist controlled countries. And so things have gotten better for the younger generation quite a bit. Now you take this house, if you look at the bottom part, it's kind of a light area. What they have done is they take the old part of the houses that were built way back in the 1920s and just add a side to them and a top to them, another floor to the top. They were so well built with the bricks that it is not necessary to tear them all down. This is Cousin Bertzi's house. Cousin Bertzi lives in this house with his wife and his mother and his daughter and her husband and their one child. That's one thing we do have, our small families over there in Hungary. So there is my aunt, her son and wife, their daughter and husband, and their little son, all living under one roof. That is because the grandma has had to take care of the little one while all 4 of them have gone to work. So everything has gone into one pot to make this family to where it is today, which is not too bad. They had a car in 1978 when we were there, and they weren't doing too badly at all. This is Cousin Valley's house. This was built, probably about 1975, something like that. Otto and Valley live on the top floor, and his parents live in the bottom floor. As I said before, there are no senior citizens' homes, so the families have to take care of each other. This is Otto and Valley's house inside. Valley is my first cousin, Uncle John's daughter, and they are sitting there with their little grandson, young Valley's little boy. This is Uncle Joe's house, but it used to be the original property of the Szabados family. I don't know when this house was built. I would imagine sometime in the 60s, but I'm not sure. Uncle Joe's daughter, Betty, and her family live here in this house. Her mother was still alive. My aunt was still alive in 87, but died shortly thereafter. And Uncle Joe had passed away prior to that time. Here again is the same house. In front of the house is a war memorial that was built sometime after the war, the First World War. And behind Uncle Joe's house was Uncle John's house. And that is where Lila and I stayed while we were there. The window closest to us here was our bedroom. This is a close-up of Otto and Valley's house again. It looks like it's quite an establishment. Actually, Otto is a construction foreman. And to be very honest with you, they tell us that they stole just about everything from the state to build this house. And the way that works is that when we were over there, Otto kept appearing on the scene all the time to visit us. And we kept saying, well, aren't you supposed to be at work? And he said, yeah, but he wouldn't say anything anymore. And after 2 weeks, he kind of came clean. He says, he says, we are living in a communist state. He says, we have no way to fight it, but we do have our ways. And our ways are that we do not work for Lenin. He says anybody that goes to work for an 8-hour shifts works 2 or 3 hours. The rest of the time they slough off. But he says the minute 4 o'clock comes and everybody goes home, then the entrepreneurship begins. And he says, we don't mind stealing from Lenin. We don't mind stealing or doing anything that causes them a problem. He says he is a foreman on a construction outfit. At 4 o'clock, everybody dumps their tools right where they were. He says, and during the night, they all run back and steal it. They leave it there while it's daylight, but during the night they steal it. So the state has to issue new tools the next morning. He says, I have to confess, he says, we stole most of the pieces for this house. He says we would go with our little car at night and load up what we could in the little car and bring it back in the night. The next morning we would go to work on the site, and of course the material wasn't there. But, so they had to issue some more. They had no qualms about it because the communists were ruling. They couldn't fight them in any other way except this way. And he says it didn't matter how high up in the companies or in the construction, like whether it was bosses, foremans, whoever, they all did it, and they all covered for each other. And the thing is, he said, in a small village like that, they knew who they could trust and who they couldn't. Every once in a while, the communists would send in a spy, but they knew immediately who it was. So they said they made life hell for the spy So pretty soon he just took off. So in essence, they were winning against the communist rule in their way. And like he says, they all did it. The whole village, they all knew each other. They knew who they could trust and who they couldn't. So therefore, this was a simple way. Here is a picture out of the National Geographic's February of 1983. It says this family passes the blocks hand to hand. It will take the family more than 2 years to finish the new house. This is the way they do it in Hungary. They don't get a construction outfit to build their homes. They do it themselves. When you have bricks, you just do it yourself. And that's what Otto and Valley did. They built with the help of their daughter and son-in-law. They built their own home, just like these people are doing. This is the post office in Markaz. And right beside the post office somewhere was the only telephone that there was in the village. This is the only store that they had in Markaz in 1978. Now Valley tells me they have 5 or 6 more since then. They used to open up at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and from about noon to about 4 o'clock they used to close and open up for about another hour, and that was it. This was a school in Markaz. It ran double shift. It ran from 8 to 12, and then the next students came from 12 to 4. You will be seeing more of this house later on, but this was my grandmother's house. Mom lived in this house for 1 year before she came to Canada. So Mom was 19 at the time that this house was built, and she was born in 1908, so you can figure out what year it was built. This is the other side of Uncle John's house where Lil and I stayed. There's Lil standing beside it. Now, if you look at this picture, and you can imagine off to the left, just out of sight, they had a summer kitchen. And the summer kitchen is where they had the stove, table, and chairs, nothing else. And that's where they did their cooking. And the first meal that Lil and I had was in this summer kitchen. And we sat down for dinner, and they had chicken, they had a bowl of white stuff that looked like potatoes, and so I don't know what else there was, but we sat down to our first meal, and we took the chicken, and we were kind of hungry, so I kind of put a couple of big tablespoons of this white stuff on my plate, and we are busy eating, and my aunt keeps saying, "Is everything all right?" And "Oh yes, it's super." And I take a forkful of this white stuff, put it in my mouth, and it is straight horseradish. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to die. I gotta wash this down. So I grabbed this little jigger of something liquor that they had poured, and if you can imagine, it was straight moonshine. So between the horseradish and the moonshine, I just about did away with myself the first meal that we were there. And if you can imagine, my eyes were tearing, I was crying inside and screaming, and on the outside they had not known that I ate horseradish and downed it with moonshine. I was ready to explode, but it all went down. Nobody knew the difference, and I thought I was very proud of myself for being able to pull off something like that so gracefully. I wouldn't have hurt their feelings for nothing. Anyway, when we were finished eating, when the fire went out in the little kitchen, summer kitchen, when it got chilly, then we would move over to this house, and there was a little living room that was about 8 by 10. It had a wee little heater in it. It had the beds where they slept in and a TV set. So when the summer kitchen got too cold, we moved in there. They started up the fire, and we sat there and watched TV. When we wanted to go to bed, our bedroom was next door. We slept under a feather tick that must have been about a good 1.5 feet deep. We were dying of heat underneath, and the minute we stuck our noses out, we were freezing to death. The poor people, my aunt and uncle, they got oil for our wee little teeny oil heater to keep us warm. And thank God for that, because I think we would have froze to death. It was around 0, the temperature, but it is so damp that we were cold all the time. It is just unbelievable damp. We were just about freezing. I never took my winter boots off all the time we were there. You could not wear shoes. It was winter boots. Boy, was it high by the time I got home. I can remember crawling into bed one night. Lil was so sick with the cold, I threatened to have to go get a bedpan for her, but that was enough of an incentive to get her to crawl out, go outside, across behind her, over behind the summer kitchen where the toilet was. But there for a while I didn't think that she was going to be able to make it over there. But like I said, the threat of a bedpan made her move. We came home with some terrific colds, but we also had a terrific time over there. Times that we laughed awful hard, and we were cold, but we enjoyed visiting all the relatives. It was a very great experience. The only thing is, at the time I thought Lil and I could spend our old age sitting back, reminiscing about our trip over to Hungary. Little did I know that she would not be here to do the reminiscing. We had such a great time. There were times like this when we just didn't know how we could ever keep a straight face ever again. We went into this hairdresser's place. This is a hairdresser, and he washed our hair. Then he took a lemon and he squeezed it and all over our heads, and then he stuck us under this contraption. One of the things that they did was they have these little cars, the little Lada cars. I'm sure some of you are familiar with them. Of course, they're quite small, and when you have your winter coat on, it's kind of bulky. So it was tradition everywhere we went. Before we got in the car, we took our winter coats off, rolled them up, and put them in the trunk of the car, like we are doing right here. This is Otto. He took us to Budapest this day, and as we were leaving, we were repacking our coats back into the car trunk. Here is a picture again of the National Geographics of the homes that they have in one of the villages in Hungary. They are all made of brick, and I wouldn't be surprised if most of the people that have... So far I haven't mentioned World War II. Although World War I did not affect the lives of the villagers, except that the men were taken to fight in the war, World War II was different. Uncle John said the front went through Markaz 2 or 3 times, Russians on one side and the Germans on the other. It was like a nightmare. He said the German soldiers obeyed their commanders and they acted like gentlemen, but the Russians were barbarians. They were worse than animals. The old women plastered themselves with manure and mud to look as unattractive as they possibly could. But even then, some of the soldiers raped the old ladies. The young girls and women were hid. Valley, my cousin, who was about 13 years old, was buried in a hole all by herself in order to save her life. The hole was dug in the hill somewhere behind the house among the trees. Valley was put in it with food sufficient for a day or two. It was then covered up. She existed like this for 2 weeks, with her parents sneaking food to her in the night. She said the loneliness, bugs, dampness, etc. was like living in a nightmare, but it probably saved her life. Some women and girls didn't feel they had to do this. Uncle said you could hear screaming all night while women were being raped by roomfuls of Russian soldiers. He said one particular neighbor girl felt quite safe and confident that nothing would harm her, and she would not listen to warnings. In the night her screams started, he said. It went on and on and on until he couldn't stand it any longer. He figured even if he was caught, he had to go help. As he crawled down the ditch towards her house, he could see about 20 soldiers taking turns raping her. He said he couldn't have done a thing. She died that night, but he lived with that nightmare for the rest of his life. Aunt Anna was hid in the attic of the house during the day. She was also plastered with mud all over in case she was caught. The men had a resistance group in the hills helping the fighting. Once the Germans gained the town back and the commander realized the women were gone, he assured the husbands and fathers that the women would not be harmed. It took some persuading, but eventually they did come out of hiding, and the German commander was true to his word. The women were not harmed. The war saved Uncle John's life. Just before the war broke out, things were so bad that Uncle John had to sell his only cow in order to survive. But someone reported him to the authorities. He couldn't do that because everything you owned belonged to the state, and you had to notify them so that they would know exactly how much to tax you on it. So poor Uncle John didn't know what to say when suddenly the authorities appeared on his doorstep wanting to see the cow. He said, well, unfortunately the cow has run away into the hills. And the authorities said, okay, in 3 days we will be back to see your cow. Fortunately, and though it is such an irony, the war, World War II, broke out that day, and they never came back. Because had they came back and not found the cow, Uncle John would have probably spent a few months in jail for his crime. This is a picture of my grandmother's nephew, about 18, 19 years old. Went October 16th, 41. This was taken. He was on the way to the Russian front, and he was killed in action. Here is another picture of him, Steve Hagedorn. Our relatives during the war were telling us that things had gotten so bad with the front going through the village. They were left so hungry and so desolate, they didn't know what to do. They decided at that moment that they were going to come to Canada and follow Dad and Mom out to Canada. And they were on the verge of doing this when suddenly they started to think that the war had gone through Europe, it had gone through Russia and North Africa and wherever else. But they were so sure that now that they've lived through this, that if they came to Canada, that would be the next place that the war would erupt, and then they would be just caught in the middle of it again. So that was the only deterrent that they had not to come to Canada at that time. I can remember as a child, Mom and Dad sending packages, care packages over there, all bundled up to keep them eating. Things like canned meat and powdered milk is what I remember. And I remember sewing the packages up in flour sacks and writing on them with these pens that they used to have in those days. Things weren't easy here in Canada either, so I can imagine that if they had come to Canada, it would have been a terrible hardship on Mom. Well, this is the end of the tape. I didn't know how better to say goodbye than to say cheers. There's as you look on your far left is my mother's best friend from the time they were children together. The young man on my left is a young man that Grandma raised well. His parents worked out all the time. He was so grateful to Grandma, and he loved her so much, he told me. On the far side, I don't know who the lady is, but the gentleman beside me was a fellow that remembers playing with Zoli when Zoli lived in Hungary yet, and Zoli came to Canada at the age of 4. And he was a few years older, but he remembers Zoli. And then of course there's all yours truly. I will bid you goodbye until the next tape, and please forgive all the screw-ups, because there are a lot in there. I wondered if I shouldn't do it over again, and I just didn't have the oomph to do it all over again. There are so many mistakes in it. I'm not proud of it, but the message is there. Cheers.